Hi, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing, the channel where I share my experiences prepping and playing tabletop role-playing games. This video is going to be different than the others I've made because I'm not just going to be showcasing a game that I happen to be playing at the moment, I'm also going to be promoting its Kickstarter. The game is Stalwart or Stalwart 85, and it's a superhero light role-playing game written by Dr. Mike Dessing. Now, Mike is an incredibly prolific game designer that I've been following for several years. If you want to get a sense of the depth and breadth of game that he designs in all sorts of different idioms, you'll want to check out his blog, The Splintered Realm. I'll put a link to it in the show notes below. But today we are going to be focusing on his most recent superhero RPG, and that, as I said, is Stalwart. I'm going to break this video up into three different sections. The first is where I tell you a little bit about what Stalwart is as a product. Then I'm going to focus on the Stalwart core rules. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a play report to give you a sense of how things went when we played this game last night. So let's take the first of those. What is Stalwart or Stalwart 85 as a product? Well, the first thing I should say is that this is an already existing game. Mike published it a few months ago. It is about 17 pages or so of core rules and another 17 pages of companion rules, and then a setting book that I think is something like 50 or 54 pages. If you want to get a sense of what this game is all about, you can already procure it, and at very reasonable prices, just really a few dollars. And some of it is up for free. Again, check out The Splintered Realm and you'll find it there. So what is this Kickstarter all about? Well, it's simply Mike taking the opportunity to put the stuff that he's created and is very proud of, and deservedly so, and putting it all into one volume that should be really cool. And that is going to be, I think, the core rules and the companion rules all rolled into one set of rules. It's going to come in at between 40 and 50 pages, and then about 120 pages of setting material. Let me talk a little bit about the setting material. It is the world of Stalwart, and the main character in the world of Stalwart is Doc Stalwart, who is kind of like, what if Golden Age Superman and Reed Richards were merged together into one kind of scientific adventure philanthropist? It's a really fun and cool take on classic comic book tropes. The other thing I should say about Mike is that he, in addition to being a game designer, he is a cartoonist, he is a writer, he has made comic books. He brings all of that together into the world of Stalwart in a way that's really charming, really fun, really quirky, really iconic, but yet its own. It's really wonderful. I am not that interested in my own gaming to play in pre-established worlds. That's something that I think I've made clear in the videos that I've produced for this channel already. You'll know that that's one of the things that I really love about Champions now, is that it provides a vehicle to have your own unique game setting emerge through characters, and that's really my preferred way of playing. That doesn't mean I can't enjoy a good superhero world apart from gaming, and Mike's is just a really charming setting. I've read as much of it as I can, and I just really enjoy it. Even if I wouldn't play in the world, I just really enjoy it. And again, his cartoon style might not suit everybody's aesthetic, but I sure think that it's really expressive and really charming. The part that I'm interested in terms of gaming is the rules portion of Stalwart, and so that is what I'm going to turn to next. I'm going to describe what that's like, and then we'll move on to see what happened when we played it the other day. The first thing to know about Stalwart as a game system is that it operates using a dice chain, and those go from D4 to D20, and it's all the polyhedrals that you would find in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, plus a D16. So it does involve a funky die that you wouldn't find in your classic Dungeons and Dragons dice set, but D16s aren't that hard to get a hold of. And nowadays, of course, when you have die rollers online, you can fudge that if you need to. Now, the other thing to know is that each of these dice corresponds to a scale of heroic activity. D4 would be the normal scale, D6 would be the expert scale, D8 would be the paragon scale, D10 would be the super scale, D12 would be the legendary scale, D16 would be the titanic scale, and D20 would be the cosmic scale. And the first decision that you have to make when setting up a game of Stalwart is at which of these scales you're going to play. It seems like maybe the default is sort of super, which is the D10 scale, but I've seen characters made at the Paragon scale that still feel very super heroic in terms of the powers that they have. And in fact, you can have powers and abilities far beyond mortal men at all of these different scales. It's just that the higher the scale it is, maybe the more effective you would be at using these gifts. Once you decide at what tier you're going to play, and let's say that you do default to super, which is the D10 tier, then your character is going to be rolling a D10 for many of the things that they try to do, including attacking. Your chance to hit, the die you roll to hit, is based on your tier. It's kind of in that way removed from the characteristics or traits as they're called in this game. And it's just kind of a function of the scale of play that you're at. So it makes it more like a skill, I suppose, than like a raw ability that you have as a hero. There are also two things I should mention. Whenever you're talking about a die code, you have the die code, so D10 for super, but then you also figure something called the static value, or the SV. That is half of the die, right? So if you have a D10 as a super character, then your static value would be 5. And then you also write on the character sheet the half of that rounded down. So in the case of a super character with a static value of 5, their half static value would be 2, right? Because 2.5 will round down to 2. With those three numbers, you can do everything in the system, from figuring out bonuses to certain things, to figuring out the effectiveness of your talents, to figuring out your movement speeds, and all of that. A series of numbers that kind of tells you everything that you need to know in terms of the game. So now that we've established that, let's talk about the next thing, which is that characters have traits. And traits are like characteristics in Dungeons and Dragons, or abilities, I guess, in Dungeons and Dragons. There are only 4 of them. There is might, which is a measure of how strong and tough your character is. There is mind, which is how good at every aspect of the mind your character is. You know, their intellect and their will and all of that is a function of their mind. Then there is their power score, which is really a measure of how apt they are at using the powers that they have or the gifts that they have. And then there's reflexes, which is like your agility, your dexterity, etc. And the thing with these traits is that they also have a scale. You roll for them. And the way you roll is you roll your tier die plus the static value, and then you round down to the nearest die. So for example, if I roll a 10 on the D10 because I have a super character, and I add 5 to that, that's a 15. D16 is a thing in this, but that would round down to the D12. So that means that I would have just rolled a D12 to put into one of my traits. If you rolled a 9 on that D10 plus 5, then you'd have a D8, and so on and so forth. So then you roll those 4 values and you can assign them however you want. It's not a roll, straight down the line kind of system, but you can assign them how you want, I believe, if memory serves correctly. At least that's how we did it when we played. And just like the tier, the traits have the static value, and then the half static value are also recorded on the sheet because sometimes you need them for various different applications of play. There's one more thing that we need to figure out with traits, and that's figure out the derived characteristics that stem from them. There are 4 such characteristics or values. Might is associated with endure. Mind is associated with focus. power is associated with force, and reflexes is associated with evade. And the values for endure, focus, force, and evade are the static values of whatever the trait is. So if you have a D12 in might, your endure is going to be 6. And those values are important because they do different things, but typically what they are is the value that somebody trying to affect you would have to beat on their die roll. So if you're trying to hit somebody with a bolt, you're going to be rolling your tier die, so let's say a D10, and if your target has an evade of 6, you have to roll a 6 or better on that D10 to connect with the attack. And all of those work in a similar fashion. And that gives you a sense of how task resolution typically works in this game. You're usually rolling the die that's associated with your tier to beat a target number. Sometimes that target number is a value that's set by your opponent's intrinsic abilities, but at other times you're just trying to beat kind of a static number that has nothing to do with your opponent. So if you're trying to make a standard use of a gift or ability, you have to match or beat a 4 on the die. If you're trying to do something exceptional with your gift or ability, you have to match or beat an 8 using your die. And if you are doing something truly astonishing with your gift or ability, you have to hit a DT or a difficulty target of 12 on your die roll. The game does have a hero point mechanic. You typically get a number of hero points equivalent to your static value for your tier, and those are spent 1 for 1 to add to die rolls to maybe try to succeed at a task that you missed. Now let's turn to combat. When combat starts, all combatants roll their tier die to see what their initiative is, and they go from the highest roll to the lowest. When your character acts, they get a number of actions equivalent to the static value of their tier. So at super, each character would have 5 actions that they can perform on their turn. Now, that seems like a lot, and it is, but you can only perform 2 actions without incurring a die shift penalty to all your actions. And movement is considered an action. So if you're going to move and then you are going to attack, then you can do that without suffering any die shifts of penalty. But if you're going to take even one more action than that, then if you have a D10 to attack with, you're going to suffer a die shift down. So you'd be rolling a D8 instead of a D10 for all the actions that you're performing in that round. And it gets a little trickier because there are certain powers that cost an action to maintain. You might be maintaining a power and then having to choose about whether you're going to move or attack with another power. And if you do anything more than that, you are going to incur that die shift penalty. So it brings in a level of tactics into the use of these powers, but it also provides this kind of robust resource of actions so that your characters can do truly impressive things, including jump into the middle of a bunch of mooks and use 5 attacks to try to take them all down in one action. I should also mention that each round in this game is a 6-second round, so 10 of them makes a minute, and so on and so forth. As far as damage is concerned, if you land a blow, be it physical or be it mental, you cause damage, much like in Dungeons and Dragons or any such game. Your gifts have different die codes that are associated with that amount of damage you can do. Sometimes those die codes are directly tied to your traits. And so if you land a punch, for instance, and you have a D12 in might, then you're typically going to be rolling a D12 for damage. And the damage that you do is going to come off of hit points, much as they would in a Dungeons and Dragons game or something like that. Now, it's a little different though, because when your character is reduced to 0 hit points, they are felled. And felled characters are sort of out of commission, but at the beginning of each of their rounds, they are able to make a roll to see if they roll their tier die to see if they can come back into the action. And if they beat a 4 or better, they are back in, but they come into the fight with half of their starting hit points. They can come into the action as much as half of their SV. So for super characters who have an SV of 5 and therefore a half SV of 2, they are able to come in from being felled twice before they are defeated by the third time that they might be taken out in action. And by the way, if your character fails their roll to come back into the combat once they're felled 3 times in a row, then they are defeated and out for the count. That's kind of how all of that works. There are also rules for recovery of everything from hit points to hero points, and they're fairly generous, allowing for that dynamic of having heroes be very much beat up, but if they take a breather and in between scenes, they can be pretty much back up and running almost at full. That is something that I've seen Mike refine over the course of the various iterations of superhero game that he's made, and I think he's arrived at a really nice balance here. Those are the basics for combat. Those are the basics for task resolution. Really, the only thing major that I think is important to talk about in terms of this presentation is character generation. As I said before, you pick your tier, you roll your traits. That is covered. But what about that important thing in superhero gaming? Powers. Well, powers are called gifts in Stalwart, and you roll 1d6 plus 2 to see how many of them your character has. And then you roll for those gifts randomly on a master table. Now, I know a lot of you are already going to be turning this video off because you don't like random character generation, and I understand that. Just so you know, there is also a point-based character generation system that you can use if you don't like the random character generation. I personally prefer the random character generation for this particular game. It's fun and it offers a fair amount of flexibility. First of all, it provides you a menu of powers that might spark something in your mind that is different than what your defaults would be. And you always have the option of trading 2 powers that you rolled for 1 power that you want. There's a nice negotiation with the table that might lead you towards creating something that you hadn't expected to create. And I really like that kind of emergent play. Also, the table does include a few options for player's choice powers and also for custom powers. So all of that together, it leads to a kind of a fun character generation system. In addition to gifts, you also get tags. You get a number of tags equivalent to your tier SV. So for super characters, again, that would be 5. And these are these little perks that allow you to tweak certain aspects of your character. These include things like aim, which helps you to target ranged attacks, or brawl, which gives you a bonus with hand-to-hand combat, or dodge, which allows you to add to your evade, things like that. The final option that you get to decide on is whether or not you want your character to have a limitation. There's a list of limitations, like things like enemy or vulnerability or secret identity or things like that. And if you choose to take one of those, you can select one additional gift from the master list. And that's the last major thing that you have to do to make your character. Other than that, you figure out your hit points, you figure out your hero points, add some details, and voila, you're basically done with your character. So it's quick, it's elegant, and fun. And with that, I'm going to turn to what happened when we played Stalwart last night. So when we got together to play last night, it was one of those situations where we knew we wanted to play something, but nobody had anything prepared, and we didn't even know who was going to be in for a game on that particular night. About 7 of us came into our gaming Zoom room, and after a little while of talking, I decided to offer some things that I could probably run off the cuff. Stalwart was one of those, as were Mutant Crawl Classics and a few other things. And as people thought about it, they said, I'm kind of tired. I don't know if I really want to play. We had several people back out, and we ended up with a group of 4. I obviously was one of those 4, and so were Mike, Dan, and Jason. Now, Mike and Dan, you might recognize as players that I've talked about when we've played Champions Now. They've both played superheroes with me relatively recently. They're bought into the idiom of superheroes and all of that. Jason's somebody who doesn't really think about superheroes all that much. He only plays them on occasion with us, and even then, he hasn't played a superhero game with us maybe in decades. But he, like several of us, had recently watched the Batman Cape Crusader cartoon on HBO, and so he had kind of a hankering to play around in kind of a retro superhero setting. And so he was the one that said, why don't we do Stalwart? And I told the others that I was interested in doing Stalwart because I wanted to make a video to support Mike Dessing. And so Dan said, you know what, that's good enough for me. Let's do it to promote this game that you think deserves promoting. So that was it. We all signed on. As we sat down to face the random character generation, I thought it would be nice to have a central premise that we would all be working towards in terms of making these random characters. So it could be very general, but I said, what do you guys want to do? What premise do you guys want for this world? It could be that we're all teen heroes trying to do whatever. It could be that we are all science adventures. It could be just something general like that we know as we made random characters that they were going to fit into that particular box, right? That particular premise. And Jason said, why don't we do this? Why don't we make heroes that are really a bunch of middle schoolers or high schoolers that were looking at their father's comic book collection, and they found a comic book that was 50s or 40s retro. And as they were looking at this comic, they all got sort of sucked into that comic, and now they were living out this existence in the pages of this comic book. I was like, okay, that's kind of out there, but if that's what you guys want to do, and they're like, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. We set upon doing that as kind of like our orientation for character generation. We then just picked a tier. They wanted to do super, so we went super, and then we went through the die rolling process and they generated characters. Jason ended up with a character that had relatively modest traits and not that many gifts. The other guys got really lucky and they had really impressive traits and lots of gifts, like 7 and 8 gifts. So they almost rolled the maximum. And I think that's all of this is worth mentioning for a couple of reasons. One, I want to give you a sense of the time crunch that we were coming at this with, and we were able to make characters relatively quickly doing that. And I also wanted to give a sense of this being a game where the number of gifts does make a difference, but you can still make incredibly effective characters even if there's kind of an imbalance in terms of how the goods were meted out. In the game that we actually played, Jason's character was highly effective, and so were the other characters, but there was a definite imbalance in terms of what it is they rolled. Anyway, these are the characters that they produced. Jason ended up making the Midnight Maven. She has okay but relatively modest traits, as you can see here on the character sheet, but she has some pretty versatile powers. She has the True Magic power, which allows her to mimic any power in the book. There are restrictions in terms of her having to cast a spell to summon a power and then having to use actions to hold on to powers that she's kind of conjured, but it's still a very versatile gift. She also ended up rolling the gift Elite, which she attached to power, which essentially gave her advantage with all of her power rolls, which was very helpful in terms of her being an effective character. She also had the Chaos trait, which allowed for some very bizarre things to be able to happen when she used her True Magic. And then finally, she had this Object Reading power, which was kind of like an outlier power, but gave him an idea for how the Midnight Maven spent her daytime. And that was that she was a librarian working in archives and special collections who used her object reading power to discover the provenance of esoteric texts and things like that. So that was the Midnight Maven. Dan rolled a bizarre combination of powers that he ended up rationalizing into a Viking version of Wonder Woman. He named her Valkyrie, and he decided that Valkyrie worked as a museum curator at the equivalent of like the Natural History Museum in whatever city this essentially was going to be based in. That information came to me relatively early during their process of making characters, which was very important for me because once they communicated those things to me, I knew exactly what it was that I was going to run for them. See, I'd actually played Stalwart once before with my daughters and a couple of their friends. And for that game, they had decided that their central premise would be that they were magical defenders of the city, trying to fight off monsters and evil wizards and demons and things that were threatening the city. A couple of those characters were also museum curators, at least one of them was. And so for that game, I had rolled some random characters, villains, to fight them. And so when I heard from Dan and Jason that they had these concepts that would tie into that situation that I had set up for my daughters and their friend, I was like, I can reuse that whole premise, and that's probably what I'm going to run for these guys, right? So I'll talk a little bit about the villains in a moment, but that was an important piece for me in terms of my process, because remember, I didn't know what I was going to game. I had to kind of come up with something relatively fast, and that was very helpful in that regard. By the way, I was going to make a video detailing the adventure that I ran for my daughter and their friends, but unfortunately their friends walked away with their characters, so I didn't have their sheets, I didn't remember their characters' names, I didn't have the information that I needed to put that video together. So that's why I didn't create a video about Stalwart a few weeks ago. And this game gave me the opportunity to do that. Anyway, that's an aside. Let me get back to the last player here, and that's Mike. And he ended up rolling a set of gifts that very much jibed with kind of like a Captain Marvel concept. So he made kind of a Mary Marvel type, and her name is Titania. He figured that there would be a Captain Titan in the world that predated her and all of that. But we didn't dwell on that too much. Instead, we got down to crafting her, and she would be a person who had leaping powers and running powers and super strength and the ram ability and all of these. So a real kind of bruiser of a character. So we ended up with 3 female superheroes, all in a kind of retro setting. It was interesting. By the time that we got to this point in the character generation process, I was like, okay, tell me a little bit about the kids that got ported into these characters, and pretty much none of them had given any thought to that. I don't know, I kind of feel like we ended up just dropping that aspect of what we were doing, but that initial concept got us launched into this kind of retro setting. We left the door open for the possibility that we'll bring that other layer in should we continue to play this beyond this one shot. But really, I think we settled into this being an example of kind of a comic that would have been produced in the 1940s to try to attract girl readers. So you had these 3 lady heroes coming together, and that was kind of the conceit of the title. I'm not going to belabor what happened in terms of too many details, but I will tell you what we basically ended up doing. I began the session by telling Jason that Midnight Maven had been called by her friend and team member who worked at the museum, that would be Valkyrie, to come over in her secret ID and her civilian name of Isadora Pavoni, the librarian, because there was about to be a Nordic exhibit that was going to be the next exhibit following the Egyptian exhibit over at the Museum of Natural History. There was a set of runes there that nobody had been able to make any sense of, and knowing Midnight Maven's gifts, she thought that Miss Pavoni would want to come over and see if she could, using her object reading power, be able to connect to and figure out what these runes were. So we just did a little bit of scene setting and describing what it was like to come over to the museum, and describing what the museum looked like and what the Mummies of Egypt exhibit looked like and how they met and they interacted with the security guards there. They became named characters. There was the security guard, Charlie, who looked kind of like a thinner Lou Costello. And then there was the old man security guard named Phil, who I said looked kind of like a Vagoda, and they were going back and forth. And then we talked about how they entered the office where the runes were. And I asked Dan to tell me, what does Isadora Pavoni see when Astrid Van Neer opens the door and says, here are the runes that I need you to figure out? And then Dan did a really good job of describing these runes that were on this worn Viking shield and the embossment on the shield and all of that. And the writing definitely looked like something that was not a known language. I said, okay, great. Your eyes widen as you see that. Let's cut over to see what Janie Jensen, aka Titania, is doing. And Mike had decided that Janie Jensen was a reporter and that she was trying to make it in this male-dominated news business, and that she was the last one in her office typing away, and that they were making fun of her because they were like, oh, you're probably just writing a recipe to put in the whatever. And she was really working on a crime story. And so when he said that she was working on a crime story, I said, great, you're doing this piece on the mobster Roman Empire who's making a move on this neighborhood and all of that, and you're typing away. Again, there was a little bit of description and scene setting and all of that. And then I asked him to make a mind check to see if he noticed somebody that was coming in, and she didn't notice. And there were these two beefy men that came up behind her and tried to grab her. They missed. And then there was a little bit of an altercation, and Janie Jensen ran because she has a secret identity. She didn't want to turn into Titania in front of them. So she ran out of the office and closed the door and then transformed into Titania. And when the mobsters came out after her, she asked, like, were you bothering that young lady? It's lucky that I came in time. And they were like, oh, nope. No, we weren't. Yeah, you're right. We shouldn't be doing that. And they just made a move to walk away. And Titania let them walk away. And then she said that she was going to watch to see where they came out and where they went, and she was going to follow them. So then at that point, we cut back to the other scene, and Isadora Pavoni, aka Midnight Maven, used her object reading on that shield. And it was a little fun, kind of like self-referential, I guess, because basically what she was able to determine was that that shield belonged to one of Dan's characters from the Shadow Dark, the Midnight Sun game that we're playing. And then that shield had traveled dimensions from this gaming dimension, essentially, to this comic book dimension. And there was just some descriptive stuff that I said when she made the mind reading roll. And then when she came out of her trance, Astrid Van Neer said, what did you see? And Midnight Maven says, like, it's a lot. You're never going to believe it. And then they heard gunshots. They went to go see what it was, and they found Phil on the ground, shot in the shoulder, unconscious, bleeding, a gun next to him on the ground, and coming at him, 5 men clad in dark leathers with helmets that looked like German military helmets, but all in black, and they had these insignias of octopuses on the front of their helmets, and they were carrying submachine guns, and they were wearing goggles and kind of like a breather mask with tubes coming out of it. And these were agents of Kraken. They're kind of a James Bondy, kind of Viper-y, kind of Cobra kind of organization, but kind of like retro looking and stuff. So that became a confrontation there. At that point, we went into initiative. And so I started splitting the initiative between the two different groups. To make it quick, this first kind of several rounds of combat involved Midnight Maven and Valkyrie fighting the 5 Kraken agents. Midnight Maven healed Phil and told him to go call the police. The fight was happening. They were making pretty short work of these agents, but they weren't pushovers either. And at the same time, Titania was following the gangsters by leaping from rooftop to rooftop as they made a getaway in a car. The gangsters noticed her, and they kind of like tried to peel out and get away, but they ended up failing their driving roll and crashing and then running to try to get away. And she followed one into an alley and had a confrontation with him there. and threw him into a dumpster and basically said, "You go tell your boss to back off from the lady reporter, and or else." And the guy's like, I'll tell him, whatever. So she left him there, and then she started returning, bouncing from rooftop to rooftop back towards the newspaper where she worked. By this point in the other combat, things had taken a turn for the worse, though, because they did make relatively short work of those agents, but then the real villains came into the picture. And these are random villains that I had created, again, for that game that I ran for my daughters. Two of the characters I rolled almost identical power sets for. They both had flight, they both had night vision, they both had impervious, and then they had a few different powers. One had the fear power, and so I named her Fright Night, and the other one had a life tap power and a sleep power, and so I named him Night Stalker. And I decided that they were siblings. Again, even their traits were very similar. So I decided that they were siblings and that they were kind of vampiric in nature. They both had stealth, they were both fast. I decided that the two of them had been watching the Kraken agents, because they are Kraken operatives too. They'd been watching the Kraken agents getting their butts handed to them. And so then they decided to strike from the shadows. Night Stalker used his sleep power on Valkyrie and managed to put her into deep slumber. And Fright Night used her fear power on Midnight Maven and terrified her so that she ran from the scene. And as she was running, the ground started to tremble, and up from the ground came what essentially looked like an Umber Hulk from Dungeons and Dragons, with a very pained human face, looking anguished as he was following the orders of the other two. And he kind of emerged in the middle of the chamber in the museum where they were all fighting these agents. Now, it's interesting because at this point, Mike was not in this major fight, right? Like Titania wasn't in this major fight. She was bounding from rooftop to rooftop. At a couple of moments, Mike was like, oh, maybe the police are riding over there. I'm like, there hasn't been time for the police, and I'm not going to modify the situation just to get you in. The characters have recourses for calling on each other, and, a spell from Midnight Maven could have called Titania over to the scene, but that wasn't a decision players had made. So I wasn't sure that Titania was going to be able to make it to this clash in time. However, as she was bounding back, I said, it does make sense that as Stonecrusher, who is the Umber Hulkish kind of guy that emerged from the ground, Stonecrusher has a burrowing movement power, and he was like tunneling through the city to get to the museum. So I said, there's a chance that she will notice that. So I had her make a mind check, and she did. She noticed the chaos and damage he was causing by burrowing just beneath the asphalt on his way to the museum, and she was able to follow that there. Now we have a situation where kind of another phase of the combat begins. Now, Midnight Maven had initiative at this point, and in her fear, she ends up casting Multiplicity to kind of create multiple targets for these two vampires and this hulking brute to be able to kind of like hide in the crowd. And with Multiplicity, she would be creating like 5 duplicates of herself that would be indistinguishable from her. But she used her chaos power to make this happen because she had to, or she felt that she should, and she failed the roll, which means that something bizarre, over the top happened. And we had a lot of fun with that because we decided that she did not conjure 5 identical versions of herself. She conjured these alternate dimension versions of her. So there was Midnight Salem and Midnight Bunny and Midnight Steampunk version of her and an anime version of her, and all these showed up, and that was kind of the situation. When Titania arrived on the scene, she saw all that chaos, and she also saw as Stonecrusher, the Umber Hulkish kind of guy, was sent to attack the Mavens. And he tore into them, and he took out like 3 of them, leaving only the Midnight Salem Maven and the Midnight Bunny standing, along of course with the actual Midnight Maven. And at that point, Titania decided that she was going to use her ram attack and ram into Stonecrusher. She hit him full on. He flew across the room, embedded in the wall, and fell out of the wall ready to fight back. But at that point, Midnight Maven, who was still scared and suffering the effects of that and role-playing it well, cast Calm to just neutralize the situation and regain order. And she was successful. And so Stonecrusher kind of went into this almost like Zen state. And at that point, Midnight Maven just started kind of like securing some of the agents that they had ensnared and stuff like that, but had not knocked unconscious, and binding them with their belts and stuff to get them under control. Midnight Bunny came over and cast healing on her. And also Midnight Maven sent Midnight Bunny to go and wake up Valkyrie. So we had a moment where everybody could kind of gather themselves. And the reason I haven't mentioned the vampires at this point is because once they had sent Stonecrusher to attack Midnight Maven, the two of them had laughed and then left the scene, and they had made their way towards the direction of the Egyptian exhibit. Not being particularly subtle, Titania and Valkyrie decided they were just going to like burst in. There was this kind of third phase of combat that was several rounds long. They came in, they didn't see the vampires because the vampires heard them coming and hid. At that point, Night Fright cast Fear on Titania, and Titania turned around and ran back to the lobby of the museum. Fortunately for everybody involved, when Night Stalker went to go cast Sleep on Valkyrie, Valkyrie and Night Stalker had rolled the exact same thing for initiative. So I was like, we'll resolve this simultaneously. The sleep spell, or the sleep effect, was cast, and Titania felt herself kind of like wobbling on her legs, but then she went to do a shockwave, which was one of her powers. And I modified this a little bit because shockwave is usually a direct line of effect rather than like a cone effect. But I was like, you know what? If you make a power roll and reduce the power by one die shift down, and if you make the power roll, I'll let you do a smaller intensity cone effect. So as Valkyrie was going down, she did a shockwave attack, it hit a cone effect, and it blew both Fright Night and Night Stalker like out of their hiding places and like wrecked like the Egyptian section of the museum. Not good for property damage and for preserving antiquities, I know, but effective in terms of like rattling everybody. And with that, I ruled that it broke Fright Night's concentration, which released Titania from the fear effect, and also released Midnight Maven from the fear effect too. Midnight Maven at this point was still working on getting healed and sending Midnight Bunny ahead and stuff like that. So bottom line, Midnight Bunny woke the unconscious Valkyrie right as the vampires were kind of getting themselves back on their feet. Titania came back in, and a kind of quick and furious combat happened where they started to get the better of these two vampires who were really resilient. They actually really held their own, but they were on the verge of getting knocked out. So there was one more last final desperation of Sleep and Fear, which was enough to create an opening for the vampires to flee. And the heroes then were able to consolidate the gains they had made, which is one, they had prevented the vampires to do whatever it was that they were going to do in this in the museum, and therefore they had thwarted Kraken's designs, whatever they might be. They also managed to apprehend Stonecrusher and the agents, and the idea at this point was to interrogate those folks. And they sensed that Stonecrusher was kind of like an anguished individual, an individual that maybe wasn't acting of his own accord. So they were like, maybe we can save him, and maybe we can find out what it was that Kraken wanted to do here. And I was like, those are great plans. That sounds like the beginning of an issue 2, right? And they were all very excited. The brief check-in that I had at the end of the game was, Mike was like, this was a lot of fun. He's like, this was a lot of fun. Jason also said, this was a lot of fun. Dan seemed a little bit more circumspect. I think he did have fun, but he was a little bit bummed by having been put to sleep 3 times by Night Stalker. And I get that. But, you know, I said, look, this is the dude's power. It's an effective power. It'd be foolish for him not to use it. He didn't only use that, he also used his life tap power. But this is who the guy is. And, you know, if you're going to charge in knowing what the guy's powers are, it's kind of going to be a predictable outcome. And I said, there's nothing wrong with that. In the end, they were victorious and they were effective, right? The heroes were. But yeah, I mean, you go up against a guy with a very powerful sleep effect. You might have to be prepared to go to sleep a couple of times. He also found a couple of the wording of some of the powers a little bit confusing. I didn't, but I think it is fair to say that there was one issue that the other three players were confused by until we kind of talked through the logic of how the powers work. And that's that they didn't know that, you know, impervious and invulnerable say they protect against physical damage. And they assumed that that meant that it didn't protect against energy damage. And so there was one point where Dan was trying to use an energy attack instead of a quote unquote physical attack to be able to affect the vampires, both of them who've had impervious. And I was like, well, I don't know why you're trying to do that. I mean, they're both, an energy attack is a physical attack. And I'm not sure where that confusion came in. I'm going to look again at the wording of the powers to see, you know, what it was. I think it's just that the rules make a big deal about picking an energy type that, like resistance, for example, defends against. And I don't know if the specificity of the resistance power made them think that impervious was different. I also wonder if that's not kind of a holdover from the way that old champions used to work, right? Where you had a physical defense and an energy defense, and if they were just kind of confused by that. But whatever, Dan was a little confused by some of the wording in the book, and I'm going to go back and take a look at those sections and see if I can make any suggestions to Mike about clarifying things. But for what it's worth, I didn't find it confusing. I thought it was, you know, I understood exactly what Mike was aiming for with the wording. But those misgivings aside, it was, I thought, a really big success. It was a lot of fun. It was something that we were able to put together in the moment and just roll with it and have a lot of fun. So I am excited for Stalwart. I am excited to play more of it. And yeah, and if I do, I will post more videos about it. But in the meantime, I really encourage folks to check out Mike Dessing's amazing work over at the Splintered Realm. I encourage you to drop over to the Kickstarter and look for Stalwart 85. When this posts, there should still be about 15 days left in the Kickstarter. And Mike really does deserve to have his work seen and appreciated. So thank you for sticking here to the end. As always, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.